We're going to end the day with a bang, with a big panel for you, if they could come on up. And I will introduce Rear Admiral Craig Quigley as they come up, who's the moderator of our next panel and familiar to many of you. He serves as the Executive Director of the Hampton Roads Military and Federal Facilities Alliance, a public-private partnership dedicated to attracting, retaining, and growing federal facilities in the region. A career naval officer, Rear Admiral Quigley served 27 years on active duty, achieving the rank of Rear Admiral and serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Public Affairs at the Pentagon. Upon retiring from the Navy, he accepted a position as Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs for Lockheed Martin Maritime Systems and Sensors, leading a 30-person communications team across 8 states for a $3.5 billion operating company. Following Lockheed Martin, he returned to federal government service as the Director of Communications for U.S. Joint Forces Command in Hampton Roads, Virginia, during a time of great transition in that organization. He is a 1975 Distinguished Graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and has served as President of his class. Among many other roles, he serves as a member of the Communications Committee of the U.S. Naval Academy Alumni Association Board of Trustees, the Board of Directors of the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance, the Board of Directors of the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, the Board of Directors of the Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce, and the Board of Directors of the Hampton Roads Chapter of the U.S. Naval Academy Alumni Association. So thank you very much for joining us and for helping to organize this wonderful panel to finish up the day.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to finish strong, and my promise to you is that this is going to be the best panel of the day, with all due respect to the 3 prior panels. What we have today is actually a collection of 3 two-person panels. And we've been discussing sea level rise and the challenges of that to the region and the nation and the world, indeed, all day long. And I'm reminded of the old cliche about how do you eat an elephant? And the answer, of course, is 1 bite at a time. This issue can just seem enormous and daunting and really difficult to wrap your head around. And there are some who would just throw up their hands and say, this is just too hard. But this is something we must deal with, and I have every confidence that we will. So I would like to introduce our panel members, and we're going to do this in 3 two-person panels. And I'd like to ask that you hold your questions until all 3 of the panels have finished their presentations. Some of our panelists have slides, some have chosen to just speak, but when done, we'll be glad to take your questions. First, we have heard several times today from the gentleman to my left. Colonel Jason Kelly serves as the 58th Commander of the Norfolk District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He has been in that position for the last 2 years and a couple of months. He is a graduate of West Point, I won't hold that against him, with a mathematics degree where he was commissioned there in 1994. He has held a variety of positions. I'm not going to go over them in the interest of time, but I'll just make this aside. He is the only person that I personally know that has earned 4 master's degrees. Second to Colonel Kelly's left is Doug Beaver. Doug is a very recently retired Navy captain. He's a Hokie, and he is a 2016 alum of the Civic Leadership Institute, second only to the class of 2013, which is, of course, we all know is the best class ever. Doug served 27 years in the Navy as a naval flight officer, and his final assignment in uniform was as commanding officer of what we have heard many times today is the world's largest naval base at the Norfolk Naval Station. Doug now serves as the military liaison for the city of Norfolk, and I cannot imagine anyone more qualified to serve in that position. So he took that on earlier this year and is doing a splendid job. Next is the Honorable Donnie Tuck, Mayor of the city of Hampton. Mayor Tuck serves on my board of directors, as do the other elected leaders of Hampton Roads. He's a Duke University graduate, 1976, with a bachelor's in public policy, and an ODU grad with a Master's of Public Administration. He has had a very interesting career in government, broadcasting, sports information, and technical writing. Mayor Tuck has served on the City Council of Hampton since 2010, and earlier this year was elected mayor of the City of Hampton. Next is Navy Captain Dean VanderLey, who is dual-hatted as the commanding officer of the Navy Facilities Engineering Command Mid-Atlantic, as well as Rear Admiral Jack Scorby's staff civil engineer for Navy Region Mid-Atlantic. Captain VanderLey has started off in submarines and was served on a ballistic missile submarine, the USS Michigan, up in the Pacific Northwest. And he transferred to the Civil Engineering Corps, which is no small feat. The submariners do not like to give up their people to other specialties. But he pulled that off in 1998 and has been a civil engineer ever since. I want to call out his qualifications because, again, similar to Colonel Kelly with 4 master's degree, I don't know of another person that is qualified in submarines and CB combat warfare, is joint qualified, is a member of the acquisition professional community, is a registered professional engineer, and a certified energy manager. You are a universe of one, as far as I know. Last but not least, on the far end is Mr. Ben McFarlane. He is a senior regional planner for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. Now, if you're not familiar with what a planning district commission is or does, there are 21 of those throughout the Commonwealth, and they deal with issues for a collection or for a region of the Commonwealth. And advise and do staff work for the municipalities who are facing similar challenges. It can be stormwater management, it can be land use policy, and many other things. Ben's forte, he is the lead planner for the Planning Districts Commission Coastal Zone Management and Coastal Resiliency Program. He is a bachelor's in economics and a master's in urban environmental planning from UVA, and is the perfect capper on our panel today. So with that, I will start with Colonel Kelly.
Well, sir, thank you for certainly a warm invitation. And as the resident Army guy, between a host of naval officers, and having had to tread lightly for the last several years, I'd like to first let the record reflect that Army is bowl eligible and already having accepted its bid.
I knew this was coming.
And we won last year, so now we're ready.
I knew this was coming.
To start. Let me first thank Elizabeth for the invitation and an opportunity to participate today. It's truly an honor to be among such an august and accomplished group. I've spent much of my day taking notes and really gathering things to think about. I'm looking forward to going back to the office on Monday and sharing some of what we've heard today, because there's certainly been an incredible day. I hope to prime what, if we're successful with this panel, will be rich dialogue during our Q&A this afternoon. What has been sort of my calling card, or certainly what I hope to do when I succeeded Paul, was implement much of what he started, be an agency of action. And I think that the way the day's events have been structured, the collaborative efforts that we'll discuss during this panel, I think are examples of a region taking on the challenges that we've discussed. Last week, Major General Funkhauser visited Hampton Roads during the 100-year celebration, and during that he highlighted USACE resilience principles. And so I'd like to start my brief portion revisiting and speaking as an enterprise guy. The resilience principles that the Army Corps of Engineers proffers and uses is to prepare, absorb, recover, and adapt. And you heard that this morning from our keynote. And that's because climate variability and change impacts absolutely everything that we do. So we don't have a choice whether or not we're going to take this on. We're in it. We are a part of the way forward and have every intent to be a part of the implementation of the way forward. And I think today you've heard various examples of the Corps and our activity in this regard. USACE has a resilience initiative roadmap that they've put out and published, and it's available. And in that, we conduct studies to identify solutions. I'm always hesitant to speak to studies because usually when you mention that, folks tend to believe you're admiring the problem. You want to spend more time and sort of looking at something we already know. And I like to speak of it as the way to authorization, the way to dollars. So the study is the means by which you get the Army Corps of Engineers involved, and it's a very important part of everything that we do. These studies identify existing risk, potential reduction measures. We make recommendations in the studies to reduce the risk and the vulnerability of all that we do. And so again, with my agency hat on, the resilience roadmap and strategy that we have is to evolve core standards and support community resilience. I think it's appropriate that I'm here today and starting the first of the two-person panels with Doug Beaver, because I think what we've done and what we're doing in Norfolk is foundational for what can and I believe should be done in coastal communities throughout the United States. I think Norfolk has been the ideal non-federal sponsor. And I think what's most important about what we're doing with Norfolk is that the Corps of Engineers effort is additive. It is not the initiative, it's one of the initiatives, and I think that that's the way forward. I had an opportunity to take examiners from OMB out and tour some of what's happening in the city of Norfolk, and one of the first questions was, what exactly is a non-federal sponsor doing other than what we're talking about? And I was able to highlight much of what the city of Norfolk is doing, and you'll hear more of that when Doug speaks. But I think it's very important in terms of the way forward and getting the Corps involved and getting those things that we want to get accomplished ultimately budgeted. I think that's a very important piece. As we think about what we're doing with the Norfolk study, which by the way should be hung and posted today for public comment. I've been checking my phone here throughout the day because Susan Connor, our planning chief, has assured me that that's getting out today. And so I'm going to call Susan here during the reception to make sure that that's done. The Norfolk study is an important one. It's an interim solution. It's by no means the answer. And I think that's important. The Norfolk study builds upon the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, and because the city of Norfolk was ready, we were able to get that going. I think it's important, and that, again, was initiated under Paul Olson. And so what we've done, and I've been the benefactor of some hard work on the front end, we're doing that again in conjunction with the Commonwealth, much dialogue ongoing, Delegate Stolly, understanding that what we're doing in the city of Norfolk is by no means the answer. We're meeting with other municipalities, other locales. We recognize that we've got to get to the peninsula. We understand that the answer does not lie in the Norfolk study, but we're using it to nudge and sort of introduce some new ideas, specifically natural and nature-based features. They don't score well in the core processes. We understand that. But what I believe is if we continue to talk about some of these things, and I'll present here in a few months to our headquarters, and we'll have our another major milestone where I'll present, and I'll talk about some things that may not make the actual chief's report. But I understand that talking about them will set conditions for subsequent studies and allow us to continue to nudge and move forward on that. Chief's report is scheduled for 2019, early. It's needed for Congress to act. Representative Whitman, Representative Scott, Representative Taylor, all engaged on what's happening and trying to find ways for us to advance and get things done. Was very encouraged today when Mr. Rogie, when you ended and you talked about a requirement of progress, and that being collaboration, community participation, and leadership. We have that, and I think that you'll hear that throughout this panel, that that's happening, and the progress that I think we'll reap, the benefits are going to be the result of those relationships and that progress.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, for the invitation to be here today. And as he's bringing up the slides, I just want to say that the Admiral missed one qualification or achievement from Captain Dean VanderLey. As many of you saw in the movie Tidewater last night, he's also an accomplished actor and minivan driver. So, but once again, it's great to be here today. Jason just mentioned it, and I want to highlight the fact that in Norfolk last week we had a symposium, a full-day symposium that was entitled Naval Station Norfolk, Charting Our Next 100 Years. And as we had 4 panelists try to get their arms around 100 years, what that looks like, and as we talk about what our coastline and our geography will look like in 100 years in this coastal community, that was a bit too much for that group to get their arms around. But it was, one gentleman in the room, one of the panelists kind of hit the nail on the head for me. The Navy's been around for 242 years. I can guarantee you in 100 years, as the Constitution states, we will have a United States Navy. And the largest naval station in the Navy resides in Norfolk. So what are we doing to maintain that military readiness in the 59 warships, 18 squadrons, 60,000 people that live, work, and thrive on Naval Station Norfolk? So the community of Norfolk was established in 1682, and it has been a resilient city since that time. It survived plagues, wars, hurricanes, and social upheaval, but time and time again, the city has been resilient and it's rebuilt itself. And Jason hit the nail on the head, I think, when he said the city and the Corps and all of our partners that we're collaborating with, we are action-oriented when it comes to this problem. And I'll go over a few things that we're working on at the tactical level and the operational and strategic, if you will, in the city. And as the Admiral mentioned, I'm recently retired from the Navy, so the city has a Chief Resilience Officer, Ms. Christine Morris, and her team, and that team is dedicated to being that action agent in the city. Christine couldn't make it today. She is the pro from Dover. I'm here to carry the city's message forward, and I'm very honored to do so. Okay. Pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation, Norfolk was one of the first 33 cities designated in their 100 Resilient City program. And that's dedicated to helping cities around the world become resilient to physical, social, and economic challenges that are a growing part of this century. At the core of the City of Norfolk's resilience strategy is the commitment by each citizen, organization, and municipal system, and by leadership from all sectors to acknowledge our stresses and vulnerabilities and to work proactively to find solutions. Norfolk's resilience strategy is driven by 3 goals shown above. These goals were created as a result of a 2-year engagement with the community. The actions that support these goals and the strategies beneath them are diverse. They range from developing the gold standard in resilient land use codes to collaborating with global partners to innovate the next generation of water management techniques, to exploring new financing models like catastrophe bonds and social impact bonds. I encourage all of you, as I try to keep this as brief as possible, to go to the norfolk.gov website, to the Office of Resilience tab, tab and learn more about the 100 Resilient Cities effort and our strategies to combat sea level rise. I want to highlight just 6 things that are underway currently in the city, and I'll go through these fairly quickly because we've already talked about the HUD, National Disaster Resistance Competition, or NDRC, implementation. This was a $112 million federal grant for us to tackle the Ohio Creek Watershed Project, as well as Paul mentioned in the previous panel, the $5 million for the Coastal Accelerator. The Chesterfield Heights and Grandy Villages have been selected to participate in this transformational coastal improvement project, and we're very excited about it. The next item is Retain Your Rain program for citizens, and this is a grassroots level initiative for creating the coastal community of the future, growing new industries, and increasing cohesion in our communities. We're asking all of our citizens to join us as partners in successfully managing runoff by holding rain on their properties. We've held workshops in the Arts District in Ghent, Norfolk's Neighborhood Expo held at Military Circle, and we will continue to hold these workshops and information sessions across the city. We're also working with partner organizations such as Master Gardeners, Elizabeth River Project, and others to offer residents a web-based program to connect with organizations to begin installing rain barrels, rain gardens, and other water retention features. The third item is our Vision 2100 program, and this was established in the fall of 2015 as a part of overall resiliency efforts. Its overall goal is to design the coastal community of the future, ensuring that Norfolk will be a dynamic, water-based city well into the future. This is all about how we will make those decisions, whether it's the city's infrastructure investments or its response to development proposals. Vision 2100 will aim to ensure that resources are used efficiently with an eye towards the future. So how does this relate to other efforts in the city? Vision 2100 is integrally linked to the city's efforts as part of the 100 Resilient Cities initiative, as well as the city's Neighbors Building Neighborhoods initiative. The input collected as part of the Vision 2100 planning process is informing those efforts, and the strategies developed for each are reflected in the other. And the next item is the joint land use study. It's been mentioned a couple of times. That's collaboration between Virginia Beach, the Navy, Department of Defense, and the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. And the focus of this is to study the many federal facilities, particularly on the Navy side with regard to sea level rise. And I know Ben is going to talk about this, and so probably is Dean, so I'll let them, I won't steal their thunder. Also, as Jason mentioned, we have the Coastal Storm Risk Management Study. We're looking at the entire city to reduce the risk of flooding, and we're looking for the Corps not just to do this study, but we're doing this as a partnership, as Jason mentioned, and that's very important. It's known as the 3x3x3, 3 years, $3 million, 3 levels of review, and we're in the midst of that and on track to finish that study in 2019. And lastly, I want to mention Norfolk is home to NATO's only headquarters outside of Europe, and from May 2nd to the 4th of this year, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Transformation and the Mayor of Norfolk hosted a conference examining interdependency and resilience. This was supported by leaders from 34 NATO and EU nations and more than 30 private sector partners. The conference improved understanding and visibility of what resilience means across the city, and with our private and military partners, established knowledge transfer and developed actionable proposals to improve mutual collaboration to help build resilience. The conference paper entitled Building Resilience, Collaborative Proposals to Help Nations and Partners has now been published, and that was published in June of 2017. It identifies tangible proposals to help build to help build the 4 key themes identified by the conference and widen the aperture on how our nations and partners build resilience through trusted collaboration. So once again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to address you all and some of the initiatives that Norfolk is doing, and I want to say that The collaboration between the Army Corps, the Navy, the surrounding cities has been and continues to be something that will allow us to continue to engage on this and stay action-oriented. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Captain Beaver. Our second two-person panel is going to be Mayor Tuck, and once again, we call on Colonel Kelly to be a part of that one, and we'll hear about Newmarket Creek. Mayor?
Good afternoon. Let me say how honored I am to be a part of this panel. And I think it was Admiral Stockdale back in the 1996 vice presidential debate who asked the question, why am I here? But this is a very, very outstanding panel, and I think the fact that I'm the only non-military person is what gives me pause. But I'm very, very honored also to be a part of a panel with Colonel Kelly, who I regard as the E.F. Hutton of environmental policy east of Richmond. Proponents and opponents of different kind of environmental decisions wait with bated breath for his decisions. I've been a resident of Hampton Roads for about 27 years and a resident of the city of Hampton for 15. And I would think probably in the last 20 years, there are two seminal moments when we talk about flooding and issues. One would be 2003 with Hurricane Isabel, and the other would be October 2009. That stands out in my mind because I ran for council in 2010, and probably everybody who ran talked about trying to do something about flooding. And one of the things I do as a former council member and as a mayor is when we have different kinds of storm events, I kind of go to the areas where we typically have large amounts of flooding and talk to residents. And what they'll tell me generally is that we didn't experience this kind of flooding until Isabel. And one of the challenges, I believe, for our city staff is that when you have a stormwater system that you tell is designed for maybe the 1 in 100-year floods, is that you get those more frequently. But we've been living with water in Hampton for over 400 years. We've had a collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers that reaches back for some 50 years. We've worked with projects related to Chesapeake Bay shoreline. We've had navigational channel studies, and our more current project right now is that of Newmarket Creek. And currently, we're sponsoring this feasibility study with the Army Corps of Engineers to evaluate the structural and non-structural measures to reduce the risk of flooding in the Newmarket Creek watershed. And I'll talk more about it later, but it depends on where you live in the Newmarket Creek watershed. It affects your attitude about the flooding that you get. I think it was 2 years ago, I went to this one area, and the gentleman told me that if he'd known 6 months ago before he bought his house about this type of flooding, he never would have done it. But the Newmarket Creek watershed is relatively flat and is subject to both rainfall and tidal events. Now, the next steps as far as the Newmarket Creek study is for the Army Corps of Engineers to do a briefing to the leadership of our city. And then we'll take these, what they present to us, and try and formulate solutions with the Dutch dialogues. Now, the Dutch dialogues, our relationship with them is actually guided by our guiding principles, which is one, create solutions that are driven by our values, and I'll discuss those a little bit later. We want to reinforce our assets, and this is a tried and true principle, which we focus on what is good, what works, and then we want to build from that. And then we want to try and layer the public benefits. And in this picture you see what basically would have been a ditch to carry away water, but what we've done is we've tried to make it solve more than one problem. For example, creating this ditch, we decided that we can envision a ditch with multiple public benefits. It's been widened to create more of a floodplain with vegetation for habitat. We've got a multi-use path that has been built next to it for enhanced recreation. And then instead of having houses that face away from this particular ditch, we now design those so they face the ditch. So we've created another kind of amenity. Now, what we heard when we talked to our different citizens from different neighborhoods was that we experience rain and tidal flooding too frequently. Again, we talk about the 1 in 100-year storms that are occurring on a much more frequent level. Flooding is not tolerated. We expect the city to keep floodwaters off private property, and we also want to create spaces to detain and clean the water. Again, this is from one neighborhood. There's another neighborhood which is actually bordered by water, and they like living on it. They expect some level of flooding, and one of the things they value is access routes to get out if necessary. Otherwise, they don't mind staying in place. And they also value electricity so that we can stay in our homes during most events, so keep the power flowing. The values we talked about were equity and responsibility. We want to try and make sure that we come up with innovative solutions. We have a history of innovation in Hampton, and we want to continue this. We also want to have nimble, adaptive, and actionable items. What we want to create solutions that can be adjusted and adapted over time, or as best practices and knowledge change. And then we want sufficient economics. We believe that there are opportunities within our coastal resiliency initiative for Hampton to position itself for new industries and companies to create jobs and livelihoods. Now, when we think about our evaluation tool, we want to make sure that it's tunable to other localities. In other words, what we learn in Hampton, we want to be able to apply with other cities and other localities. And our aim is to make it easy to use and to get project proponents to consider resilient solutions. And we have 4 federal assets in Hampton. Each one has kind of a water boundary, and that's the Joint Base Langley-Eustis Facility, NASA Langley Research Center, Virginia Medical Center, and the Fort Monroe National Monument. And these are all important facilities that are near tidal shores. And our concern right now is what happens outside of Langley Air Force Base. And what we've done as a city is we've created a joint land use study that looks at properties that might affect the activities that go on at that base. And what we've done now is the city has gone into a joint purchase with with Langley Air Force Base to buy up some of those properties to clear out the clear zone, which is possibly where crashes could occur on the approach to the flight line. And so what's next? Well, we're going to get a briefing. So the council members and city staff will get a briefing, and then we'll begin phase 2, which again will involve more with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Dutch dialogues, and then we'll look at continuing to collaborate. And I have this last slide here because this is actually a lighthouse that existed from 1829 to 1956. But there was a storm back in, oops, I missed it. Long and short of it, it no longer exists. Thank you.
You whipped it out. Thank you, Mayor.
So to round out this second panel, I previously highlighted Corps of Engineers activities in the South, and Mayor Tuck highlighted some of what we're doing here on the peninsula, specifically with Newmarket Creek. Very early, much work yet to be done, but we're a learning organization, and we're applying much of what we've learned over the last few years regarding resiliency, and we're putting that into motion. And I think what you heard is the public participation. We're going to go present. We're sharing, and that is in line with this theme of collaboration. What we've learned is that we have a role to play. We're a specific piece of the response of the resiliency puzzle. We don't own it. We don't own the community, nor its strategy. And I think it's important for certainly an Army unit, the Department of Defense, to appreciate that those locales, certainly as a non-federal sponsor, and that's come up a couple times today, but we're doing that together. Our actions are complementary, and I think that maintaining lines of communication, relationships matter, so we're spending considerable time forging relationships so that we can work through and be mindful of what's best for a particular community. Natural and nature-based features, I mentioned that. We've got to figure out within the Army Corps how to incorporate, how to score. We have not figured it out yet, but I think that continued dialogue, continued communication It's coming at us on all fronts. Everyone is asking about it, and we're working through and figuring it out. Those discussions are being had, and I think it's because of the collaboration, because we are mindful of what the community desires are. I don't think that's always been the case, but I'm happy to share that we're doing that. I think we're starting to better understand neighborhoods. We're starting to be mindful of social and community resilience. Again, not something that habitually we've done, but we're certainly mindful now and incorporating that into our studies. And it's tough because I think that the bin in which we're supposed to make everything fit and then this chief's report pops out on the other side doesn't necessarily lend itself to the evolution of what's happening in this space. And as we have gathered here today, figuring out how to work that into some rather rigid core processes. We recognize that there's a great need in the region. Working with the Commonwealth, you heard some discussion earlier today of some proposals so that the Commonwealth could be the non-federal sponsor. There may be some value there. I mean, it has to be endorsed and figured out, but those are things that will certainly help some of our potential partners who may not have the requisite share for very large projects. I'd just like to speak for a second on the Dutch dialogues because that too was a learning vehicle for us. The effort in Hampton is a continuation of work that began in the summer of 2015 in Norfolk, and we as an organization were involved and supported project level discussions, but we also provided some technical expertise. But in addition to what we provided, we were also the recipients of those discussions and added to what we learned. We were able to think about some of the things that the Dutch have started, some of the discussions with the community that we otherwise wouldn't have gotten that are now included in our smart planning process. Doug mentioned the 3x3x3. We're struggling with how to keep that on schedule. Right now in Norfolk, we're one of, or at this point, I think we may be the only study that has not requested a waiver. Challenge with that, and this week, because I wanted to make sure we got it out this Friday, because we have to get it published in order to have public comment. We've already scheduled in the city of Norfolk a public meeting that we're going to have at the Addicts Theater in the middle of next month. Well, if we don't get it out for public comment, then that meeting will have limited value. But internal to our organization, we're supposed to have legal review. We're supposed to have completed some real estate review. Well, within the stovepipes, even in our building, they desire more fidelity. We can't get that and be compliant with the 3 years. We've got to get it out, get the public comment. So what I asked him to do was get the train wrecks and let the fender benders go so that we could then get it moving, have the discussion, knowing that we'd get another bite, that we'd be able to make it a little bit better. So some of what will be shared this afternoon will have many questions because it's not resolved, yet it has to be that way in order to be timely with our SMART process. Early public participation is required. Some of our attorneys are uncomfortable with some of the things that I'm asking them to publish and share, but we're going to do it because I think it's the only way. Otherwise, we would not make the timeline. We would not have the sharing early that I think is necessary. So there's a degree of transparency that many of us are uncomfortable with because that's not been our way. And I think that that is a lesson that we've certainly learned. We are trying to learn to live with the water. And it's my goal that the core processes that many of you know, the lines and the boundaries in which we've asked many of you to color in and make sure that, and sometimes our response is our process doesn't work that way. I'd ask you to continue to challenge us because we're trying to put forth and grow and evolve. And it's that sort of dialogue and collaboration by way of these relationships that I think will continue to do better and in the collateral good that we'll do for Hampton Roads and quite frankly for the nation by virtue of what we're learning here, will continue to add value. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Kelly. And our third two-person panel, ladies and gentlemen, is Captain VanderLey and Mr. McFarlane with a third specific example of collaborative solutions. So, Dean?
All right, well, I would like to echo the thanks to Elizabeth for the invitation here. It's really my honor to be part of this panel and to just talk a little bit about some of the things that the Navy is doing in partnership with Hampton Roads to look at the challenges we face. So one of the themes we've seen today, I think, is the tremendous interdependency of our Navy bases and our local communities. I think that's especially true in the Hampton Roads area. You know, just a few examples. I think you've heard some of the numbers already. The Navy provides over $7 billion in direct financial impact to the Hampton Roads area. There's over 100,000 people that go to work every day at Navy bases in the Hampton Roads area. But the Navy's also very dependent on the local community. So all those people that go to work on those Navy bases, you know, they live in the local community by and large. They travel to work on roads that are, you know, owned and maintained by the local community. Most of the utilities that we use on our bases come from the local community. So there's a real symbiotic relationship between a local community and a Navy base. One of the ways that the federal government helps to promote that cooperation with the local community is something we call the Joint Land Use Study, or JLUS, and I think there's been a number of references to that today, and that's what I'm going to primarily focus on along with Ben. So the goal of a joint land use study is to promote compatible development. So it's in the interest of the Navy that the local community be successful and that community is able to develop economically. And it's in the best interest of the local community that the Navy is able to continue to accomplish its mission, and that the things that the local community does to promote its economic development is done in a way that also helps promote the mission of the Navy. So joint land use studies, as you've seen, we've done a lot of them all over the country. They are usually focused on encroachment primarily. So a lot of them are associated with aviation operations. Encroachment is something that's very, can be very damaging to Navy operations if there's incompatible development around an aviation base. But this joint land use study, which is being done in cooperation with the cities of Norfolk and Virginia Beach, has a number of other different things it's looking at. And one of the ones that we're going to especially look at today is the idea of resiliency, or promoting development that keeps in mind the challenges that we face with the climate and with the recurrent flooding that impacts both the Navy and the local communities alike. Many of you are probably familiar, but in case you aren't, I just wanted to highlight the area this covers and the Navy presence that's in those areas. So you can see, a couple times it's been mentioned, the city of Norfolk includes the biggest Navy base in the world. And I have a few slides that kind of highlight a little bit. The numbers are a little mind-numbing, but I have a few pictures and other things to show you that kind of highlights just how significant the Navy presence is in Hampton Roads. We also have Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek Fort Story, which you can see is really two separate geographic locations. They're primarily focused on expeditionary warfare, Navy special warfare. You all know about the SEALs. And there's also some very unique training that goes on there that can't really be done anywhere else, especially at Fort Story. We see Naval Air Station Oceana. That's the East Coast Master Jet Base. Over 300 aircraft call that place home. And it is really the center for naval aviation on the East Coast. And then finally, we talked a little bit, it's called the Naval Support Activity Hampton Roads. As it's been discussed, it's the home of the only NATO command outside of Europe. Also the home to a lot of the headquarters commands and the senior military folks in charge of the Atlantic Fleet, as well as the Navy as a whole. And just one other thing, it hasn't been mentioned here, but as some of you may be aware, there's another joint land use study that's going to happen And it's just in the process of going through approvals that's going to cover Chesapeake and Portsmouth. Because as I talk about the Navy here, you can see I haven't talked about Norfolk Naval Shipyard, which is very important, and Chesapeake. Although Chesapeake has less of a naval presence, there are a lot of our folks that live in the Chesapeake area. So I'm just going to highlight a few of what makes Hampton Roads special with regards to the Navy, and why Hampton Roads is really critical to the Navy's mission. So Naval Station Norfolk, as we talked about before, the biggest Navy base in the world. You can see some of the numbers there as far as economic impact, the number of people that work there, the home of 5 aircraft carriers, a lot of aircraft, a lot of ships, the home of the Atlantic Fleet. Most of what you see going on across the Atlantic are, from a Navy perspective, are ships that are coming out of Norfolk. Naval Air Station Oceana, which also includes the Dam Neck Annex. Again, as I talked about, home of the Navy's master jet base for the East Coast. Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek 4 Story, again, as I talked about, the home of the SEALs and the home of a lot of the expeditionary forces that again cover the Atlantic Fleet. And finally, Naval Support Activity Hampton Roads, primarily a headquarters command. It also covers a lot of the other different special areas around Hampton Roads. But again, there's in addition to just the headquarters commands, a lot of the command and control out of the Atlantic Fleet, for the Atlantic Fleet, is also done out of NSA Hampton Roads. So it's got a significant mission itself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben McFarlane. He is going to be able to give you a lot more details. The Hampton Roads Planning District Commission are the ones really doing the up and down lifting for the joint land use studies, and so I'm going to really lean on him to give you some of the details about what we're really doing there.
Thank you, Captain VanderLey. So the good news is that I don't have slides. And I know if my watch is correct, I have -3 minutes until the reception starts. So I'll try to be quick. First off, thank you, Craig, for the introduction, and thank you to Elizabeth and the Virginia Coastal Policy Center for inviting me to participate. I'm very happy to be here today on this panel particularly, and also be here at the College of William & Mary, and I think every UVA grad owes the college a debt of gratitude for convincing Thomas Jefferson to found another university. So it's always fun to be here. As Craig mentioned, I work for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. We are the regional planning agency for southeastern Virginia, and before you think that sounds really important, what that means is that primarily we bring our localities together so that they can make decisions on their own and sometimes work together. It does not mean that we actually tell any of them what to do, and I see some faces nodding in the back. So we have 3 primary responsibilities. One, as has been mentioned, is that we provide technical assistance to our localities. We also act as a liaison to federal and state agencies and coordinate their activities and their desires and their programs with local efforts. And we also act as a forum for local leaders to come together and discuss issues of greater than local concern. And I think sea level rise and flooding are 2 of those issues that are fantastic examples of exactly what those issues of greater than local concern are. Our role in the joint land use studies that have been mentioned today is to coordinate those processes on behalf of our participating localities. So we're not really driving them. What we are is we're providing the car, and we're opening the doors and letting Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and soon Portsmouth and Chesapeake, hop in and do the driving with the Navy in the passenger seat. So, really excited about these projects. Think there are a lot of potential benefits that will come out of them. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for Hampton Roads in particular to be at the forefront of really, I think, pushing and challenging the Joint Land Use Study program at OEA to be a little bit more than it has been in the past. As Captain VanderLey mentioned, traditionally a lot of these joint land use studies focus on things like airfields or ordnance, areas where if the military is doing something and encroaching civilian development comes up near the fence line, that accidents can happen, that things go boom, and people can be injured or property can be lost, and everyone wants to avoid that. So that's kind of the easy joint land use study approach is, keep things out of the crash zone and Don't build houses next to ordnance storage facilities and things like that. And we have a lot of experience with that at Hampton Roads. Previous joint land use studies and on the south side with the airfields at Oceana and Fentress and actually at Naval Station Norfolk, and then also on the peninsula with the joint land use study that was done for Langley a few years back. But these new joint land use studies are different in a lot of ways. And I think that the big issue here is that whereas before, when it comes to civilian development, local authorities have a lot of authority. They can change policy, they can change zoning ordinances, they can change, to some extent, building codes, depending on what the state says. But localities can't just write a new zoning ordinance that says that sea level rise is not going to happen here or that the floodwaters won't come up. That's a slightly different problem, and it's not something that a joint land use study was initially designed to be able to handle. But I think we're at the point now where we have willing partners at the local level and willing partners at the Navy and with OEA to take advantage of the existing program that the Joint Land Use Study program is and kind of push against the cardboard box, maybe not break out of it entirely, but work on it in such a way that we can adapt it to what our needs are here. And so when it comes to, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the Norfolk, Virginia Beach study for a few minutes here, is that we're looking at this in a slightly different manner. One big issue is, and it separates this from other studies that have been done, is that we're looking at 4 installations simultaneously. And that's sometimes been done before. It's not the first to look at multiple installations, but it's certainly not common. We're also looking, if you remember the map that Captain VanderLey showed, far beyond the fence line. A lot of these studies look at areas that are right around where that fence is, and we're looking at everything within the city of Norfolk and the whole top half of Virginia Beach. So we understand that the assets and the infrastructure and the services that the Navy relies on, there are a lot of those that are in the cities, and they extend far beyond the areas immediately adjacent to the facilities. So right now, with the Norfolk, Virginia Beach study, we're focusing on identifying the utilities and other community assets like roads, and programs and services that those installations rely upon, and understanding better how those facilities, those assets, and those services are vulnerable to flooding. I think traditionally, joint land use study, we think about what the base needs, but in general, the core operational readiness of a facility, of a military facility, is can they get the people there to actually do the mission? And if you can't get the people there, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. And last time I checked, the military is not really interested right now in building self-serving communities entirely within defense. They got away from that a while ago. So we're working with our localities to identify what those vulnerabilities are. We're trying to really understand and analyze how important these assets are. It's not enough just to know which stretch of Hampton Boulevard floods, but we need to know how frequently it floods, when does it flood, how deep does the water get, and that in turn will allow our localities to take that information back and help to prioritize their capital improvement programs and other policy decisions. Because today we've been talking about flooding and sea level rise and the importance of the defense industry or the defense community to our region and to the nation. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are a lot of other priorities out there the localities have. Our job here with these joint land use studies is to fully inform, as much as we can, the discussions that localities have within themselves so they can put responses to flooding within the context of all the other needs that they have going on, whether it's schools or hospitals or other services that they're trying to provide, that this becomes something that they can factor in to their improvement programs. And the last thing, and I think that is one of the most important things that we hope to get out of these joint land use studies, is to really formalize, to establish and make concrete lines of communication between cities and the military bases that call them home. We have a lot of informal relationships in the region between the civilian communities and the military, but too often what happens is that certain people retire or people change jobs, and those lines of communication get broken. And what we'd like to do is really use these joint land use studies as an opportunity to make those things much more permanent, because this is a conversation that's going to go far beyond the 2 years for these joint land use studies. This is a decades-long process of discussion, of adaptation, of decision-making, and we want to use these studies as a way to kick off and make permanent that relationship between the localities and the Navy and the rest of the military community in Hampton Roads. So, and I think the last thing I would say is right now, flooding is a nuisance. It's a problem. It's a little bit more of a nuisance for some folks in Hampton Roads than it is for others. But our goal with these joint land use studies is to make sure that it does not become an existential problem for these bases, that we lose them, that they end up having to go somewhere else. Our job here is to try to keep the Navy and the Air Force and the Army here in Hampton Roads as long as we possibly can. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard 3 specific examples of how to get at a collaborative solution. It's not necessarily the way to do it, but it is a way to do it and get about eating that elephant. So if you have questions, would you please try to direct them at a specific individual if you have it, or if it's for the panel as a whole? Everybody wants to get to that reception.
That's right, I tell you. Well,
Elizabeth, back to you.
thank you to the panel. Oh, Paul, did you have a question?
I sure do. I gotta say, with the anniversary, 2-year anniversary of me retiring, now I can officially ask the Corps of Engineer a question and not have the lawyers jump on me. What I was hoping that we'd hear today is a little bit of a rethinking of dredge material and the beneficial use of dredge material. We heard from Kit that we're going deeper, wider, safer. That means there's a whole bunch of land that's currently under the bay that could be brought up, dried out, and sent somewhere for freeboard. Currently, I know that the Corps believes it's cheaper to deposit that offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. That might have been the case in 1960 and 1970, but I think this material has value now. Is the Corps, or are you personally relooking that?
So, Paul, great question, and we absolutely are. Significant interest in the beneficial use of dredge material. In fact, while here today, we had a chance to sit down with Diane and Nick from Senator Kane's office, because that's a consistent and persistent question on how best to take advantage of suitable material, the good material. We definitely want to do that, but again, as I spoke to those lines, the federal standard definitely dictates in terms of price, and as of this moment, when it exceeds the federal standard, which permits open water disposal, the locality, some sponsor pays the difference. And so that's the reality, and that is the standard. What we're now trying to look at are there creative ways, better ways? There's certainly interest on the Eastern Shore. Tangier, for example, we've proffered a idea that by way of beneficial use of dredge material in our navigation business line, our flood risk management business line, our aquatic ecosystem restoration business line, we may be able to find some integration in some ways that would be worthy of appropriation, worthy of funding, that would allow us to even reimagine Tangier, some different ways to create sales and by way of beneficial use that may be able to gain traction. A moonshot, I'll admit, but an idea by way of beneficial use of dredge material, and being mindful of the desires of Maryland and the restrictions on open water disposal, in coordination with John Bull, VMRC Commissioner. He too is not a huge fan of open water disposal. So yes, we are, but I think that it's one of those nudges, Paul. I think that it's one of those things that we've got to start talking about, which we are, and I think we're a ways out from really that being the answer. I think we're moving in that direction. We're starting to have some discussions that I think will allow us to revisit the way we currently do business.
Other questions? In the back of the room. Hannah.
Thanks. So as you've noted, this is a somewhat unorthodox use of a joint land use study, that you're addressing climate change and working at a much larger scale. I'm wondering, for anybody who wants to answer this, to what extent do you think that's a legacy of the previous administration, and would it be possible to initiate joint land use studies like this now?
Yeah, okay, I'll try to answer that question.
Ben.
So I think, I think as you might have seen on one of Captain VanderLey's slides, that climate adaptation was listed as one of the compatibility factors. I'm not sure if it's still on the list. They might have graded out a little bit for the new list, but what we have in our discussions with OEA about all these projects that are going on in Hampton Roads that are joint land use studies is, I think, we have a lot of experience in Virginia using euphemisms to refer to climate change and sea level rise and whatnot. You may have heard the congressman refer to recurrent flooding earlier today, that's something that we've used in Virginia a lot. And I think for us, the terminology that we have focused on and that we have identified for our reporting for this is flooding. Sea level rise on its own is not the problem. It's because sea level rise is going to increase the frequency of flooding. That's the problem that we're dealing with. And in that context, the fact that we can identify 2 roadways being flooded, major access points to facilities that are being flooded. Now, I don't know if, well, one, we've got 3 joint land use studies in the region going on right now. I don't foresee the region being blessed with any more in the foreseeable future. We've kind of hit the jackpot for these couple of years. But in the future, I think being able to point to specific issues like flooding of roadways that provide major access to facilities or flooding of infrastructure, that's something that OEA will continue to look upon favorably when funding these grant proposals.
Can I just?
Sure, yes.
And the other thing I'd say on the joint land use study, one of the things that we're all working together to ensure is that the recommendations of the joint land use study are not at odds with those recommendations coming out of, specific to Norfolk, the Norfolk Coastal Storm Risk Management Study. It's my hope that as we look at Hampton Boulevard, the recommendations that we're going to make to mitigate some of the flooding that will also be reinforced by the results of the joint land use study. And I think it's that nexus that'll really demonstrate the value of, from the DOD side and then from the civil works aspect of our mission, that coming together will result in an authorization from our chief's report, but then a desire to appropriate from both the defense and within our civil works. And so when we start talking about new starts and projects that are moving to construction, I hope that is the place where we're able to, again, see the collaboration and the action that I talked about in my opening comments.
Other questions? Elizabeth, back over to you.
Let's give a hand to our last panel. I told you we'd end with a bang. We did. Thank you very much. I want to say very quickly what a privilege it was to host this conference today. It was all about, as Colonel Kelly pointed out, there was a lot about collaboration and partnership and encouraging the development of good, sound policy. And the Coastal Policy Center itself is a partnership between the law school and VIMS and the Virginia Sea Grant. And so we firmly support that approach. We were glad to have the opportunity, and thank you all for coming. We'd invite everyone except for Ben, because of his Thomas Jefferson comment, to join us in the reception down the hall in the Holly Room. And thank you again.